State your name and who you represent.
Of course. My name is Justin Levitt. I'm here on behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. The reference was correct earlier. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, very much for inviting me here to testify. I agree both that you have an issue that's caused much debate here in front of you, and I think it's very important to take the tack that you set out so early of trying to get at the real facts behind what's at issue here. I have written testimony that I've made available to you all. We've also published documentation reports that I'm happy to make available. I didn't bring enough copies to the committee here today, and for that I apologize. I'm going to keep my remarks as short as I possibly can and leave you with written testimony and any questions that you wish to ask, including I may be the right person to respond to some of the incidents that you brought up before with Ms. Trotman. Chairman Smith, so I'm happy to address any of those that you wish. As I mentioned, my name is Justin Levitt. I'm counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We are self-identified as progressive, but we are vigorously nonpartisan, and I'm here strictly in a nonpartisan capacity. The Brennan Center does public policy and research and legal advocacy. We focus on fundamental issues of democracy and justice, and we think respectfully that you have one before you here today. Our method, our trade, is to focus on evidence and to go back to the facts that have been established and try and root all of our recommendations and all the policies we advocate on the basis of those facts. We emphasize the factual research because we believe the best policy is grounded in careful cost-benefit analysis. And just like you wouldn't start in on a construction project or make a major purchase until you were sure that the benefits outweighed the costs, the same is true in election policy, and particularly for Texas, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act requires such an analysis. This hearing today is about proposing restrictions on the way voters can and have traditionally identified themselves at the polls in order to vote. And with respect, I'm here to testify against the proposal because I believe the costs do outweigh the benefits, that this legislation you all are considering imposes far more costs than problems it fixes. Others will talk today at great length about some of the costs that this legislation may impose. I'd like to focus, if I can, in limited time, on the negligible benefits that it provides. In particular, legislation requiring a restricted form of ID in order to vote at the polls gets at only one sort of problem. It's only designed to get at one sort of problem, and that is impersonation fraud, people pretending to be someone else when they show up at the polls. We have documented, the Brennan Center has documented, allegations of all kinds of fraud. Some are reports that we've validated. They actually turn out to be true. Many are reports that we've debunked that turn out not to be true when you look at the real facts. Impersonation fraud is special in our research. It's the only sort of fraud that you could possibly address, and what's most notable about it is how strikingly rare it is, not just to prosecute, but to find, to discover, to report the fact that its existence at all is so notably rare. Now, some attack this research that we've done saying that we're denying that fraud exists, and I want to be perfectly, absolutely clear. There are some kinds of fraud out there. You've mentioned some, Mr. Fund mentioned some, other witnesses will no doubt mention others. It's more rare than people believe because many reports are either sensationalist or sloppy. They confuse fraud with clerical error. But sadly, it does occur. People still do buy votes. They still do pressure voters in nursing homes. They still do commit fraud, and unfortunately large amounts of it, using absentee ballots. They did, in the 1970s, use party boss systems to break the law using insiders, the long-standing Brooklyn scheme that Mr. Fund mentioned. What they don't do in any significant number is commit the sort of fraud that restrictive ID laws like the one before you could possibly fix. At the end of the day, yes, it has happened. There have been a tiny handful of substantiated cases out of hundreds of millions of ballots. Americans are struck and killed by lightning far more often. Now, some, including Secretary Rokita and including Mr. Fund, has said there are only a few of these reports because this sort of fraud is hard to find. But even without eyewitnesses, and there are often eyewitnesses,
there will often be a victim. And there will always, in every single case, be a paper trail, including poll book signature and other records at the polls. That is to say, in this case, there really is a dead body every time, because you can go back and look at the poll books to find out if someone else has signed in for that person, and whether it was a mistake, someone above or below in the records, or whether it was an entirely different individual. We've done that research, and so we know it's possible to trace after the fact. And if you want to swing an election, you've got to do this many times, which means many chances for someone to cry foul. The hunt for this fraud has been on and a major national issue at the same time that federal law enforcement made it a priority, and at the same time that private actors are equipped and extremely motivated to find it when it happens. There were lots and lots and lots of people looking. And so if this fraud happened with any frequency whatsoever, over most of the last decade, you'd expect the phones to have been ringing off the hook. Not prosecutions, just reports somebody stole my vote by pretending to be me at the polls. Instead, there was barely a ring. Every year, there are far more reports of UFO sightings than of fraud that an ID could prevent. This exceptionally rare phenomenon has been used to drive policy that unfortunately creates far more real problems than it solves. And restrictive ID rules are one good example. They don't solve real problems, but they do create them. When you start shutting down the ways in which voters can prove that they are who they say they are, you start shutting out eligible voters. Real people. Most eligible voters, we know, have ID and have it handy, even photo ID. But many do not, disproportionately elderly and minority citizens. I was behind one such senior citizen in line at the airport on the way out here. She did not have ID, she didn't have photo ID, and she didn't have other backup ID. And she went through the very same process that Representative Anchia asked Mr. Fund about, the secondary screening. It took, I know because I waited for her, it took 15 minutes. She went through, she had the x-ray scan, she got through and was able to get onto the plane. And that's because private industry and the federal government all recognize that there are some citizens out there in the 21st century who simply don't have particular forms of ID. And they make accommodations for that. It's not easy. It's much easier to live in modern society if you have an ID. That's true. Andy Young believes that's true. That's right. But we understand, private entity understand, and the government has a responsibility to make sure that when a right is provided for everyone, as voting is, that everyone can be validly accommodated, that every eligible citizen will have the opportunity to exercise that right, just like the woman in front of me in line at the airport. Making things more difficult at the polls, by the way, also increases the burden on poll workers and on election officials. More restrictive ID means more confusion at the polls, and for those who don't have ID with them, more anger. It also means more provisional ballots, right in the most hectic period of the election cycle. And your question, Mr. Chair, about provisional ballots in Marion County is spot on in that respect. It is a concern and should be a concern. I see that I'm coming down to the end of my time. I want to address two things if I can. One is the argument, we heard it before, that asking for photo ID will increase confidence in the system. And I want to call special attention to the study, the only study to date, empirical evidence. They went out and asked voters who live in states with photo ID laws and live in states without photo ID laws, do you feel more confident in the elections in your state? And the voters responded with unmistakable equanimity, it did not have an effect. There was no statistically significant correlation. If you believe there's fraud, you're going to believe there's fraud whether somebody asks you for an ID or not. And if you don't believe there's fraud, you won't believe there's fraud whether somebody asks you for an ID or not. So when people say it makes the voters feel more confident, a study has been done and that's been shown not to be true. The other instance that I want to